Okay, that was really great. Thank you, Nate. Can we give a hand to Nate Mullen? I mean, my goodness, the the alchemist, the alchemy of social trust and care. Uh, okay, here we are. Oh, I love that you took your shoes off, Keith. Um, well, I'm excited to moderate this panel titled Somatics, the Biodigital Convergence and the Technological Body. That sounds a lot drier than what we're going to get into. And by the way, Devaki, you really set the bar very high for moderator. I'm going to try to keep my vocal cord print very minimal. I want to give as much space and time to these incredible people. So I just want to give you a brief overview of the theme. Our exploration will delve into the concept of somatics. One might describe it as a language that speaks through the body's unique ability to sense, perceive, and respond in ways that often elude the grasp of the rational mind. Continuing today's series of Metaspore explorations, a central question emerges regarding somatics. Can we truly bridge the enigmatic gap between mind and body? This persistent question has profound implications for our disciplines, ourselves, and the world we inhabit. More than that, somatics invites us to consider whether a deeper appreciation of our corporeal selves and their intricate connections to the realms of biology, chemistry, and other species might lead us closer to unraveling this enduring mystery. In charting a new path forward, somatics holds potential as a transformative force. At a time when the biological and the digital are converging, it offers the promise of dissolving barriers between human and machine, human and non-human, and even extends to the realm of extraterrestrial life. Our panelists are experts in their respective fields, from Indigenous studies to digital media and astrobiology, and they each bring a diverse range of perspectives to the table. Each panelist will have an opportunity to share their insights on the topic of somatics and the mind-body connection. So, throughout the 30-minute conversation, I'll encourage the panelists to engage with one another's ideas, which I don't think will be difficult. And we value your input, so feel free to submit questions or comments during the Q&A follow-up. So, I'd like to introduce you to each panelist. Tishan Hsu, I first came across your work decades ago and probably saw some work that you made in the late 80s and 90s and thought it was, very, very current and contemporary. You have a very enduring, very sort of forward-thinking, formal language with your work. So it just feels always fresh every time I see it. Tishan Hsu's path-defining artwork over more than 5 decades has continually interrogated what it means to be human versus machine, ultimately collapsing their division in order to underscore the relationship of technology to the human body. Formerly trained as an architect, Hsu's use of materials has delved into painting, drawing, sculpture, and computer-generated media. Hsu's work has been exhibited in the US and internationally and has held multiple teaching positions at various institutions. Sara Walker, the work of astrobiologist and theoretical physicist Sara Walker is truly out of this world. From her inquiries into the origin of life to the possibility of life on other worlds. Her research team at Arizona State University is building fundamental theories for understanding what life is. Answering this question is no small task, and her efforts have been recognized through awards for early career researchers who have made significant contributions to her respective fields. And Keith Williams, Across his inspiring research and work, Keith Williams draws extensively from Haudenosaunee teachings, post-human philosophy, and lived experiences. His writings on biodigital convergence have been especially influential for my own thinking around more than human relations. Williams is an assistant professor of educational studies at Athabasca University and adjunct faculty at First Nations Technical Institute. Let's give them a warm welcome. So I'll just prompt you with a question, but don't feel that you have to hew to any sort of call and response through me. I think you have plenty to talk about. If you feel that the conversation can lead to other areas, then please feel free. But maybe I'll get you primed with this initial question. In an age where technology is advancing rapidly, what are the ethical considerations surrounding the merging of humans and machines? And how might this influence our understanding of somatics and the mind-body connection? So, can I pose that to you, Tishan, initially? And anyone can jump in. There's no order here. If you want to defer.
You want to jump in?
No, I think it's a great one for you.
I mean, that's an overwhelming question.
Oh, should we chip away at it?
I think ethics is very complicated as we're in the 21st century. I don't feel I'm an expert, first of all, in anything. Basically, I proceed in a way of really unknowing. My whole practice, I think, is just asking a question. And I think the kinds of questions that we have today are so complex to answer that we all kind of just make a stab at it, and perhaps through communication, we're getting a sense of something here. So with that, I would say that I think the convergence of biology and technology, or the body and technology, is going to happen, is happening. It's already happened. I think we're at the very beginning. I think ethics and morality are part of being human, as we have known it. And that is a very profound question to be asking at this time, historically, for the species at this point. That's where I would begin. I think that even to pose the questions is complicated as to where we go, particularly when we're starting to think of, well, like in my conversations with Sara, just what is life? How can you begin to talk about ethics and morality when we're beginning to question really what is life itself, beyond even the human species? So this is what I kind of mean by the complexity of it. Yeah, I would leave it at that, just as my answer.
Okay. Sara, do you have some thoughts around this?
I do, but I actually wanted to ask you a question, if I may, which is why you think this particular moment is so profound.
Well, coming from, I guess I think the merging of technology and the body, or our species, and I say that because I feel at this point in time, which I never would have imagined 20 or 30 years ago when I started this question, or started to ask this question in my work, is unprecedented. And I think it's unprecedented for the species that, again, in a way I never imagined. I mean, even at this point, which I think is really the beginning, the penetration, I think it's actually been quite violent, of technology into our lives is really new. And when people say, there's nothing new, we've done whatever can be done, we're in decline, the world's going to end, but at the same time, this is really new. And I think the complexity is because, one, we don't understand it, and I think, in a way, we haven't even taken the time to understand it because of, frankly, capitalism, where it moves so fast and it's so unrelenting that makes it even more complicated.
Yeah.
That's where I'm coming from.
I see.
Yeah.
I ask because I also think this is a special moment in history, but I don't know if that's just, a cognitive bias we carry. We always think we live at a special time, or if there's something really deep and interesting happening now, and what that even means. But I think the lens for me on these kind of questions, so I can't speak on ethics, and for the reason that you already well articulated, I feel like there's fundamental questions that we have to, pull back the layers and ask in order to understand what we're even asking about. And so I think for me, the context of understanding the current moment is always buried deep in time, in the sense that life has been on this planet for billions of years, and all of that history has accrued in the present to make what's happening on this planet now. And we can't really understand this as new if we don't understand how much of what is happening with life evolving into technology is already a manifestation of things that have been happening on this planet for as long as life has been here. So, I think we can think of technologies in biology. So I like to think of like some of the oldest technologies on the planet are like things like the ribosome, which, is a molecular structure inside of all of our bodies. And the interior structure of that molecule has not moved in 3.8 billion years. It's the same pattern that's been reconstructed on this planet for 3.8 billion years, and it lives in all of our bodies. And right now, there's a very rapid pace of us generating novelty, and the question is, I think, how long are we making structures that will last for? So is this a period that will lead to new kinds of scaffolds, new kinds of technologies, and will they be a billions of years lifespan, or will they just be a transient moment that we experience now? And I think the origin of life is kind of an interesting lens for thinking about. So, like the geosphere transitioned into a biosphere, and now a biosphere is transitioning into a technosphere. And it's a really unusual process because of the reflexivity of that. So we're a technological species now that's able to ask really deep questions about the origin of life and try to solve this problem, yet we're living in a world that we're embedded in, we're embodied in, where we see things becoming animated and alive around us all the time. And so I think these sort of two problems are really tightly coupled in the moment that we live in now, and this is why I think the what is life question is so much about what we need to, it's like, for me, it's like this generation's deepest problem, like in past centuries, I always have a lens of physics, but, like gravity and motion were the 1700s, and like clocks were, mechanical at that time, and it was just all very, and our worldview became embedded in these kind of ideas of that moment in history, but I think what's happening now is radically different, and we have to build a new way of thinking about reality and how the world works based on that. So, yeah. We're entangled, as you would say.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I guess for me, there's maybe I'd like to start by saying maybe we could all take a moment and just reflect on, with gratitude, all of the, and I think maybe Nate said something like this earlier, all of the people, our ancestors, our future ancestors, the plants, the animals, the fungi, the rivers, the rocks, the trees, the moon cycle, the sun, all of these elements of creation that have got us to where we are today. And for me, I feel so much gratitude for that. And if it weren't for all of those relations, I wouldn't be here. Really, none of us would. And I think for the Haudenosaunee, and that's part of my own background on my father's side, for the Mohawk people and the Haudenosaunee more broadly, the question of what is life has never really been a question, because we recognize the entire world and our cousins, the stars, and the other celestial bodies as animate and as products of the Creator. So it's for us, that's never really been a question. And I guess the other thing that came to mind as we're all talking is, let's see if I can remember what I was going to say, is around, well, let me back up for a second. I live in Nova Scotia, and I go to a herbalist quite regularly with a friend, and it's really striking to me the extent to which they empirically examine my symptoms and they talk to me, they look at my fingernails, my eyes, everything. And I compare that to my experience going to like an allopathic doctor, and how it's very different. And the diagnosis may include a little bit of observation, but it typically results in either some kind of pharmaceutical prescription, or luckily enough, not for me, but for a lot of people, typically people maybe go for blood tests or MRIs, or have to get a PCR done on something to figure out if they have a genetic condition. And I guess what that's led me to, and this is the inspiration for this came from reading one of Foucault's early works on the birth of the clinic and the clinical gaze. It's just thinking, like, in a way, like, I guess in terms of technology, I feel like we don't really understand what it means to be embodied humans. I feel like that's something we're still trying to figure out. And I feel like, when you look at the evolution of, for example, our healthcare and medical systems, like, it's as though, and I think this could apply to many technologies, it's as though we've wholeheartedly handed over, perhaps, what makes us fundamentally human, and we've given that to machines. And there's no question that these machines or these technologies can extend our perceptual abilities, but at what expense? And I just think, I don't know, I just like to return to what, one of my mentors and elders, Dan Longboat, he's a Mohawk guy from Six Nations, and he often says, he refers to ancestral knowledge as new, K-N-E-W, rather than N-E-W. And I kind of like that. And I just wonder, how fruitful would it be for all of us to return to some of those ways of knowing?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I myself, when I was making my earlier artwork, people used to say that my work was about the body, and I would vehemently deny it. And I think that at the time it was very fashionable to make work about the body, and it just seemed a little bit pedestrian to do that. But I feel like now I have a different relationship to what body is, which is ostensibly maybe the mind in the body as mind and body, that there's no real separation. So that gives me different contours to think about the body, because I was definitely probably, had that Cartesian hangover of thinking, the body, what is that about, You look like you have something.
I think I have a Cartesian hangover this morning, or maybe some other kind, not sure, maybe another kind of hangover. But I did actually. Is it okay to jump in?
Yes. Oh, please.
Quickly.
Please. I'm hoping all of you will jump.
Yeah.
So
Swim.
Okay. Well, I think binaries have come up a number of times over the course of today, and I can't remember who brought it up and where, but it's come up a few times, and it's very much on my mind as well. And I think about like Western culture and these dominant orienting forms, and so many of them they're either binaries or unidirectional hierarchies, linear. And I think, I don't know, I mean, in a sense, there is nothing wrong with that, because essentially, we're organisms that are bilaterally symmetrical. We are, binaries are very much encoded in who we are and how we are in the world. So that's, there's something very natural about that. And I think the problem, though, is that an over-reliance on binaries and linearity.
The dualism.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think, I'm more interested in dualities rather than dualism, where the two halves are recognized as not oppositional, but as two sides of one coin, or what have you, or to the two faces of Janus or something. But I guess for me, I think like what gives me hope for the future, one of many things, is imagining a future in which we can draw on the wisdom of nature's patterns and forms, not just forms, but all kinds of patterns that transcend the binary, that transcend the linear, the unidirectional hierarchies. So, I mean, why can't, I mean, and I know we do to some extent already. Like, for instance, think about the World Wide Web, but, I mean, it's a web, and I mean, I think there are other forms and patterns that, that we could bring into our world, and it's just the balance, I think, that's a bit out of whack. But I just wonder, like, what kind of thoughts, what kind of embodied experiences would that give rise to if we could, I don't know, dam that particular river, or redirect it so it's a little bit more diverse in terms of the range or the panoply of form and thought that we engage in our lives.
I actually have a question for Tishan. One of my favorite writers, Ted Chiang, he talks about the relationship that we as a civilization have with technology, that we've been conditioned through capitalism. The really early industrial period was when we first started to, conceive of what technology is as a separate system outside of nature, outside of, something that humans created. So I was wondering, Tishan, if you had the way that your relationship to technology, and I mean, how much of that capitalist conditioning influences your imagination around your work, activating the emerging technologies that we're living and seeing. Just curious about that. I mean, is there something that you see as separate? Is it so embedded it's hard to even really articulate?
I think it's more the latter. I mean, I'm totally immersed in a capitalist system. I can't but be a product of that. I can intellectually step out of it, but in my everyday life, certainly it's part of it. All the technologies that have emerged, our phones, our computers, everything is from a capitalist system. I know in recent years, talking about indigenous cultures where they're able to sustain the earth for hundreds, if not thousands of years, we have a capitalist system where, it's unclear how much longer we're going to last. So that is a very profound critique of the system that we're in. And at the same time, I'm not sure we can ever go backwards. And so I think, kind of to address your concerns, I think are very real and very profound. We need to somehow incorporate other parts of ourselves that our species is capable of in a technological future. And so I don't think the history has been written yet of where we really are going with this so-called new phenomenon that we're experiencing. I totally see what Sara was implying here. I said, well, this is totally new. I mean, I actually think that in time we're going to see that this immersion of technology in our lives will be something continuous and organic, that we created this and we are merging with it. And we may then reevaluate what we are as a species in retrospect. That when we were just with AI, there's this tremendous fear and it is tremendously dangerous. But we don't know how it's going to play out, and we may completely, or not we, but those who are going to come will have a very different idea of what or who we are as human beings or even as a species in this larger world, an environment that we came from.
And we can't put the genie back in the bottle,
and
right?
We can't put the genie back in the bottle.
And our bodies are evolving and adapting to these technologies. I know that my sleep is very much dictated by my phone in a lot of ways. And so I'm merging with the devices. And so, I mean, we are evolving in that way. So I have a question for you, Sara. And everything that you're saying, I feel like we could write multiple dissertations, very dense ideas.
Yeah.
But You've mentioned in previous discussions that we haven't quite nailed the categorization of what is life and what isn't life. Perhaps what constitutes life doesn't fit into neat boxes. I find this to be particularly interesting as I'm also often posing a similar question from the realm of art. It seems art readily exceeds its disciplinary boundaries, and would an expanded view of the physical world based on something like somatics and the engagement of all our senses be useful for searching for the origin of life or life in the cosmos?
Yeah. I think it's interesting to connect what you're saying now with what Keith was saying earlier about dualities, right? So, in the history of my field in physics, most of the major advances in our fundamental understanding of the world have been when we realized two things that seemed completely different were the same. So we call these unifications in physics. Very prominent ones are space and time by Einstein or terrestrial and celestial motion by Newton. But the entire history of physics is one where we took two things that looked totally different and we merged them together. And I think the problem of life is actually like this. It's not this thing is alive and this thing's not. It's that there's some deeper fundamental reality underlying that, which I think artists can see much better than scientists, that would allow us to understand what this phenomena is. And for me, it's something that we have to somehow merge the abstract and the material in the same kind of physical reality. So I don't think things that are abstract or informational are any less physical than a material object. And I think the sort of, if you want to think of like reality becoming increasingly virtual as it is in our modern environment, that process actually started at the origin of life, like the virtualization of reality. And the way that I think about it is you have all of this evolutionary history built up in these objects. And so these objects, in some sense, embed the history. So they're like temporal objects. So I think of us oftentimes as like things that have a size and time. It's like I'm sitting in a chair, I can measure it's 2 feet across, but I don't actually resolve the feature that it took billions of years of evolution on our planet and information accruing over time to make something like a chair or make something like my body. And those are actually physical features of these objects. And I think the world is actually getting bigger, and this is why we feel overwhelmed, because these are the objects that we're interacting with that are all deeper and deeper in time and more informational, and they seem abstract, but it's because we actually can't see most of their physicality. And so, I think that sort of process of coming into that, the way that we do it as scientists when you're acting on the edge, I think the reason I like being in these spaces is it's such a creative, conceptual space. So I can see why it resonates about thinking about these ideas and why you might have some more freedom to explore it through the media of art than the traditional tools of science, which is just interesting.
Did you want to jump in?
Yeah,
I do.
please.
Yeah. I find like everything you're saying about time is super interesting to me, and in the Haudenosaunee world, we have this teaching around, or this belief around, identity categories, for want of a better term. And so, for example, this, I don't know, maybe the chair isn't a good example, but I don't know. These jeans are, they're not just pants. They're like the sum of the entire history of everything that went into these pants. And so, for example, I mean, they're, I don't even know what it is, denim, cotton, probably. So it's, the cotton that was growing in the field, and its interactions and relationships with the insects and the other plants and the people who worked in those fields. And you could even go back further to its evolutionary history, and then the aniline dyes that gave us this probably quite toxic blue, and everything else. And so, but not just in the future, or not just in the past, but in the present and the future. And so, in a way, like that Haudenosaunee conception of time and identity categories, it's very fluid. It's like you could maybe call it a kind of like a process ontology, but that's a Western term that I'm imposing on something that's a non-Western, coming from a non-Western thought lineage. But what I find particularly compelling about it is, or something I find particularly compelling is the confluence of that, like our traditional thinking, with some new philosophical developments in the field of new materialism and posthumanism. And so, for example, Karen Barad, physicist and feminist, talks about space-time mattering, which I find very compelling. And it's the idea that, if I can get this right, that space and time are matter's agential performativity. And I love that kind of, she talks about it, or they talk about it in folding, kind of like a tea biscuit, which is one of my favorite things. But I just saying. And so anyway, so I think there's something really interesting there, and that leads me to another thought, and that's another notion, and this is I think this applies at least across Indigenous thought in Turtle Island, and it's the idea of relational coherence. So the kind of, and we kind of got into this a little bit yesterday, Sara, the idea that when we set the table in a certain way, that prefigures the possibilities for tomorrow, and that also aligns with prefigurative politics, which I think is maybe coming out of the Italian workerist movement. I'm not really sure. But I think there's hope in that. There's hope in that, and so what we're doing here matters, because this is setting the table for the next meal.
Thank you for that. And also, I think our sort of mythology around what an artist is really underscores this, the sort of the counter attitude around relationalities. So this lone genius artist, especially like a painter who's a sole author. And I've been really interrogating that for quite some time, that an artist is a hub. It's a hub for creative activity, and there are lots of different collaborators. And even if you are ostensibly a solitary painter in your studio, there's still the microbial collaborations, the people who stretched the canvas and, made the linseed oil, and the relationality. And that's how I think about art making today, and the narrative that I would like to really try to foreground, that we are not these sort of standalone, siloed, autonomous artists. We are embedded in a relational network. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, Sara, earlier in my introduction, I was talking about not knowing and embracing that uncertainty. As a scientist, it's probably very risky to sort of really get behind that philosophy. But how do you apprehend when, every 10, 20 years, these new disciplines like microbiology, it destabilizes what we thought of the concept of the human as this autonomous self, and it turns out actually we're probably these glorified condominiums for microbes, and that the human is not in the driver's seat. And so when you, with these new research areas that are developing, how does that impact you as a scientist in thinking, okay, this is the best hypothesis we have going, and then all this new research just kind of douses that hypothesis? Are you encouraged to pivot and adapt? I mean, how do you relate to that?
I don't think I take anything as absolute. There's no piece of knowledge that is not subject to revision, and I think the sort of practice of doing science to be effective at it is you have to decide what your anchors are. So, these are the things that I'm going to hold true and build out from here. But you also have to be willing to revise what those scaffolds are. And I think the real frontier of science is when you're adaptable, like you know what question you're trying to get to, but you're willing to change that structure at any given moment and reject something. So, I'll sit here and I'm a physicist, but I don't believe in the second law of thermodynamics, right? And so this is like heretical in my field. But it's not consistent with a lot of other things I think about how the world works, and I can see logical reasons that might be, but so I think being able to give up anything, but I would readopt it if it starts to make more sense to me for some reason. So I think that process is actually the most important thing you can do. So I think I enjoy the surprises and the shocks because they give me more space to work in. And so it's almost like you want to look out for those. The more surprising an idea, as long as it's logically consistent, the more interested I am in it. And the more it reframes the way we understand things, the more I think that that's actually a good heading, as long as it's fitting in with the rest of the pieces. So it's kind of like building a mosaic.
Yeah, and keeping it loose.
Yes.
Learning to let go.
Yeah,
Right?
right.
When
Yeah.
to adapt and
Yeah.
evolve around ideas and, ideas, as I said in the introduction, there's very seductive.
Yeah.
But we can't just cling and attach to ideas if we have no hope of onboarding these ideas, creating an environment for these ideas to really, gain some momentum and some vital actual
Yeah.
benefit to us.
Yeah, there's something actually really paradoxical in this too, which I find really interesting, which is, like when you're told science, like culturally, it's like it's objective facts, right? And so, but in order, and so science is supposed to give us some sense of security that we know how the world works, but to do science well, you have to be somebody that is so comfortable with uncertainty and lack of structure to knowledge, and that any piece of knowledge is subject to revision. So being inside the bubble of doing real frontier science is like the most uncertain place you can exist. But when it filters out to cultural knowledge, it looks like this really objective thing. And I find this dichotomy super interesting.
Yeah, and I, as I said, I'm interested in that struggle for
Yeah.
you, and that it isn't just this. Okay, just give us the certainty, give us the diagnosis, give us
Yeah.
the solutions.
Yeah.
Because it's a process.
For
But I want to go back to somatics with Tishan, and you're like, please get me off of somatics. But how does somatics play a role in bridging the gap between humans and machines, as you've depicted in your art? Could somatics be a tool for personal and societal well-being, particularly in our fast-paced, technologically driven world? I'm giving you all the technology questions. You can totally divert it to Keith if you want. Keith has a lot of thoughts on technology, too.
I mean, I didn't consciously think about somatics at all in my work. I mean, maybe I was actually thinking of somatics. All I was doing was thinking of just, I'm sitting in front of this, at that time it was a word processor, and what is this experience? And there's my body in front of this machine, and then there's this machine that suddenly was much more engaging to me than a television. And that's because it was interactive. And I said, what is this experience that's going on here? I did not anticipate that this would be a paradigm of what we're doing. That is somatic. So as I have explored more the question, I guess I'm trying to answer, I think it's fundamental in just thinking about the presence of technology in our lives that we recognize our bodies, and that it's with the body that we get to politics. And so I think in my work, I have tried to find a way to integrate that visually, so it's not one or the other, that it's both happening simultaneously, and that we need to be aware of both realms. And I think, Keith, that's exactly what you were talking about, which is the balance here. And I think we are very much veering towards one element here. Frankly, I think because we're in a capitalist system, and this other side is not going to be supported by the capitalist system we're in. So in a way, it's a point of resistance. And I think, if anything, I think I would want to say in my work is that we need to be aware that we are fundamentally organic, and that is the deeper question going forward. Where are we in this? That's much more complicated now, I think, with the kinds of questions that AI is presenting to us. And it's a question that I have. When the people who are creating it tell us we should stop right now and take a pause, I'm saying, wow, what is this going on here? So I think it is very dangerous. And so this issue of trying to maintain our connection to our bodies and what our bodies are telling us, I can see is very much open to question now in a very active way. So to the extent that the body is somatic, and I think there are parts of our bodies that we have not tapped into, and perhaps other cultures have, and that we may need to tap into in order to find a viable way going forward. Brings in both cultures that have come in the past, as well as where we might go going forward. That's what I have to say right now.
Keith, you seem like you have some
Sure.
thoughts.
Just quickly. Oh yeah. I appreciate, Tishan, that you've brought up capitalism a number of times, because I think we can't divorce technology from capitalism, and in my opinion it's so harmful. And hearing William speak earlier about his work was inspiring, because I'm really interested in these containers or baskets, not just for healing, but for I guess you could say collective healing, really. And I just think, when it comes to, I think about that a lot when it comes to the so-called psychedelic renaissance, because that's an area that I work in. And I just, what I would really love to see, and I think this also applies to biotech or technology or what have you, is these kind of healing containers or baskets where we can explore these ideas in community, in relation, in a non-economized way. And I think rather than following a kind of a logic of capital accumulation in which the winner takes all and there are definite winners and losers, maybe we should use a different model, like a gift logic, for an example. And when I say Indigenous gift logic or gift logic, it's it's not. It's not, sometimes people think, oh, that's like, the barter system. I give my friend this thing, and then they give me this other thing back. It's very different, and it's giving without the expectation of receiving in return. And it's fundamental to Indigenous culture, and I believe it's probably fundamental to all of our collective cultures, maybe if you just go back far enough. And that's something that we can all restore in our lives. And from that point, again, I feel like this is the second time I've brought up hope, but I think that there's hope in that, and and I see it as kind of there's this concept interstitial revolution, and I like the idea because it's sort of biological, and and so if you look at the interstices between all these capitalist inflected or fundamentally capitalist social institutions, cultural institutions like universities, hospitals, government, whatever. It's like between those kind of dominant capitalist superstructures, I think there are spaces where we can use gift logic, we can use different relational ways of being with one another, and we can and that can set that relational table for the future. To bring it back to an earlier comment.
And you can practice that from the biosphere to the technosphere.
Well, exactly. Yeah, because really, like this whole dichotomy or the binary between natural and unnatural is wholly unnatural.
Yes.
Really, everything's
Yes.
natural.
Yes, and it's very and it's scrambling constantly, right? And with more data in the internet and all these things, and certainly what drove a lot of new data home for me was during the COVID pandemic. It's this virus. I don't know much about viruses, but I started researching. It's like viruses aren't technically living, and yet they help to regulate biodiversity on the planet, and they're so important. And yet, so for me, I mean, and then add AI into that conversation. It's like this binary dichotomy between living and non-living seems completely irrelevant at this point. That we just need to push past that. That question of like, okay, we're going to privilege the living and not privilege the non-living, because what constitutes living anymore? Especially if machines are getting living status as well.
Well, and that kind of thinking, like privileging the living over the so-called non-living, I mean, that's what's allowed strip mining to take place, and like all kinds of pollution and the abuse of our waters. And I just think, wow, like like, why, why are we doing this to ourselves? Because
Right.
ourselves are also in those places, and those
Right.
places are in us.
Yes, and especially even like in terms of soil science. I mean, there's
Yeah.
so much living in the soil, and what we consider to be inanimate and not living just doesn't happen to be so.
Well, and I really like the new materialist definition of agency, which, I mean, they don't talk about living and non-living, it's more agency. And it's like that's the capacity to affect or be affected. And I think that, I mean, that may not work for everybody, but it keeps it broad. And that with that, there's a lot of room under that tent, I guess.
Okay. Well, let's stay on you for a moment, Keith. So, could you explain how somatics might resonate with Indigenous worldviews and beliefs, and how these perspectives can inform our understanding of the mind-body connection? As you know, I've been following your work and your thinking around the concept of the biodigital convergence and its ability to align scientific exploration with natural rhythms. What are the potential consequences of this for our understanding of life on Earth and beyond?
Okay. I don't know if I'm going to remember all that, but if I go too far off topic, just please bring me
You
back.
can address the last question. What are the potential consequences for life on this Earth and beyond? And do you think
Yeah.
that human life should extend beyond Earth? Let's
Well,
start there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, again, in Haudenosaunee the worldview, we believe that the stars are our cousins, and all the celestial bodies are our relatives, and that's why I'm told that when we look up at the night sky and see all the stars, it reminds us to have a good mind, and a good mind is that's a traditional teaching, and it's around our minds being in harmony with the cycles of creation. And so I think space and is very much part of our cosmology, and that's exciting to me that it keeps things open. But I guess I don't know if this will answer the question or not, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and it also gets back to the time comments too. I live in Nova Scotia. I live on the Bay of Fundy, and we have the highest and the lowest tides in the world. And so since June, I've been swimming every single day in the ocean, and I love it. There's nothing better than that. It's just like I've got a friend who's an artist on the South Shore, and he says every time he goes in the water, it's like a baptism. And I'm not Christian, but I get the reference. I can feel that. But for me, what's been so meaningful about that is this opportunity to step away from the arbitrariness of and the tyranny of the timepiece, the arbitrariness of the clock. And so instead, I'm attending to another clock, like a moon cycle, a tide cycle. And so, if I've got a work meeting or something at a certain time, and that's high tide time, well, sorry, I've got an appointment with the high tide. But it's just, I think for me, there's something really profound and again embodied about, about relating to the tides in that way. And I remember hearing a story many years ago from my buddy Scott, and he said he'd been talking with some older people who also live on the Bay of Fundy. And these are people who can, they maybe spend, whole weeks, several weeks in land cutting wood for the winter. And these people can, they can feel the tide in their bodies, even when they're miles away. And I heard that, and I was so inspired, and I want that. I want that for myself, and I want that for everybody. I want that level of attunement for everybody. And so, I feel like it's a work in progress, and it's very much, diving into the water. I think as you maybe mentioned earlier, you were talking about diving into the ocean, and it's this whole body, whole person, whole mind experience, and it's. Yeah, I just hope that enough of that and enough attunement will lead me to somewhere close to that understanding, which, even those, I guess for me, which I perceive as a very Indigenous way of experiencing the land. I don't know if I went too far off topic or.
No, I mean, there's no off topic. Everything can be somatically thought of. How are we doing on time? Okay, great. So this is for all the panelists. In the context of somatics, transcending words and abstraction, how can we practically apply the principles of healing, reconciliation, and mindfulness in our daily lives, which you were kind of speaking to with the swimming, connecting with our bodily wisdom and vulnerabilities? Just how do we open up into the somatic reality that we have been conditioned to avoid and to separate? And do you have any ideas or thoughts around that?
Go ahead, Tishan.
I mean, there's a lot of things going on in the culture now where people are trying to get back to a more connected way of living. I'm sure we all are aware of that. I think just indicates a need, and the whole wellness movement is just one example. There are just many, many things. I think this just indicates people need connection to a more embodied experience in the world. Without going into all the details, but I think we're kind of all aware of that. Yeah.
Do you have, with your art practice, do you feel a difference when you're working in a tactile way versus the digital in front of a computer? We talked, in the past, and you said, I can work anywhere as long as I have a laptop. And do you have a different relationship?
Yeah, I think separate from my work, the process of my work has become so much an integration of my body and the technology. It was sort of ironic, and one of which I never imagined. So particularly with the cloud and with what Adobe has offered, I'm able to just be anywhere, and my studio is in the cloud, and I can work digitally. And the power of the computer, just this very small computer now, is like multiple times of what I could do before. At the same time, my work is very haptic and very physical, so I do have a studio. I work with materiality, and then that gets produced in one place, in one location by people. So I have this hybrid life. I try to spend half the time in a very rural area. I have 2 cats. So that connects me in a very different way. I'm very aware of that. What was your question?
It sounds like you need a balance. You need the balance.
Well,
especially-
so I was going to say that
Yeah.
I also, up until the pandemic, I do martial arts. It's not contact. It's called action meditation. It's one of the original, from the Shaolin Temple, and I'm one of the oldest practitioners in the class, and it's just a kind of movement. It's actually called action meditation. So it's not about how to fight someone, although it can clearly become very, very lethal. It's really a way that I like to move versus yoga. And I started out, and it was probably the most, othering experience I could have had, even though, clearly this came from China, or before that, India. And it was so grueling. After about a couple of months, I told the Shifu, I said, I can't do this. I'm too old for this. And he said, you will, it'll take longer. So, I did it for maybe 12 years before the pandemic. And in the doing, it just changed my entire way of being in the world. And so I saw his answer often to people coming to him would just say, just keep doing it. If they're in agony, he says, just keep doing it. My doctor told me, if you keep going and you feel pain, you're going to get into big trouble. So that was kind of a Western approach. So that really gave me a very different modality to balance this technological, digital concern that I have. And that, I think, gives me a balance, and I think it does connect into my work in some very unconscious way. Yeah.
What about you, Sarah? Where's the balance for you, and do you have any strategies?
I think intuition is so important. So I think, a lot of people place emphasis on the conscious experience and what we perceive is happening and what we understand. And I think not a lot of us trust the rest of our brain that's doing most of the processing of information, because it's not like right in the current moment for us. But I think that's where like all the intuition and the embodied intelligence actually is. So I feel like I do my best work when I have a very good dialogue with my unconscious mind, in the sense that I just like, I let it do what it's doing, and if it, like it pushes something to my conscious brain, maybe I pay attention to it, or I push. So I think of it as like pushing and pulling. It's like, what do I bring to register versus push back down? And I think it's like so important to understand that brains don't exist outside of bodies. And actually bodies don't exist on their own either. They evolve with a lot of other bodies that have brains embodied, like, like it's an entire embodied structure. So like even as like we're not autonomous individuals. There's like this ridiculous idea in theoretical physics that brains might fluctuate out of the quantum vacuum and make Boltzmann brains, and most of experiencing reality will be these like disembodied brains, and it's just like ludicrous. Like the fact that people think like, I don't know, like theories can invent really weird things, but I don't think the universe actually works that way. I think it's a constructed reality, and it co-constructs, and all of these things, they come into physical form together, and they're not disconnected. And so I think trusting more of that, and using intuition to guide how you feel about how the world works, and willing to revisit knowledge or rewrite knowledge is okay. The other point of that is I don't think that we need to inherit all the ideas of past generations, right? So I think, a lot of people want to hold on to the ideas of the past, and they just may not be relevant to the world we live in today. One of my favorite ones, I'm waiting for it to go away, is Platonism, and the idea that mathematics has an autonomous existence. Like math is a physical system. It's embodied in our brains. It has a physical form, but we've kind of pushed it away, and we don't embrace that physicality. So I think it's super important to do that.
Agreed. And that's why I've been advocating for artificial physical intelligence.
Yes.
As a counterpoint to artificial general intelligence.
Yes.
To,
like this.
promote and explore AI through biological wisdom and not strictly through pure cognition. And that was, but you look like you have.
I'm just catching some aroma here. It's really interesting.
I know.
Oh, I forgot to mention, actually, yes.
That's a good segue.
So we've had
It does smell
a
nice.
scent accompaniment for each panel. So earlier this morning we had our permaculture panel, and we had leafy green. I don't know if anyone picked up on the leafy green notes. And currently we are smelling the algae scentscape. And then our third panel will be petrichor. How appropriate to end the day with petrichor, with our memory panel. So stay tuned for that. So we need to kind of wind things up a little bit, but now we can open up for questions. Are you okay with some questions? So looks like
I like this smell.
there's a question up here.